I believe that everybody has a story, and I'm fascinated to hear them. So come with me as we take a walk down Fascination Street. The wait is over. It's finally here. After decades of making people across the country laugh.
I was trying to write the word eulogy the other day, and my phone just kept going like, we haven't found any substitutes. Spell check was a picture of a guy with his pockets pulled out going, I don't know.
And building a Guinness Book record holding podcast empire.
Yeah, get it on. Got to get it on. No choice but to get on, mandate. Get it on.
Adam Carolla finally has produced his very first stand-up special. In association with Chassis Media and Tug.com, Fascination Street Podcast presents Adam Carolla's Not Taco Bell Material.
No one in my family knew what I was doing. They didn't have basic cable. Bad sign financially when you can't afford something that starts with the word basic.
Wednesday, March 20th, 2019 at 7:30 p.m. at the Regal Cinemas, Hebner Oaks in San Antonio, Texas. Tickets are $12, and you must buy your ticket in advance. We have to meet the pre-sale ticket threshold by March 12th, a week before the event. You can still buy tickets after March 12th, but we have to hit that threshold by March 12th for this event to take place on March 20th. I'm going to be there. I'm hosting. There will be giveaways of t-shirts, goodie bags, autographed books. All you got to do is show up and be ready to laugh. For ticket information, go to FascinationStreetPod.com. Click on that portrait of Adam Carolla, and it'll take you straight to the place where you buy tickets. It's going to be fun. I'll see you there. Welcome back, Streetwalkers. This episode is with Darren Husted. Darren and I first became acquainted as mutual fans of the Nooner podcast on Kevin Smith's Smodcast Podcast Network. Aside from being a frequent contributor to that show, Darren is also a very prolific podcaster in his own right. Darren has produced, or had a hand in producing, almost 1,000 podcast episodes in total. Some of his previous podcasts focus on very specific pop culture projects, such as the cult film The Talking Cat, the reality television show The Royals, the hit 1990s film Clueless, the TV show Arrested Development, the movie How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, and his current project, Prince, Track by Track, in which Darren delves into each track on every album that Prince ever released in his lifetime. In this episode, we talk about all of those podcasts, as well as Darren's upcoming trip to a very magical place, and we talk about what's in store for Darren after he finishes this podcast dedicated to Prince's music. So enjoy, Streetwalkers. This is Darren Husted from Wolverhampton, England.
Yeah, talk to me.
Welcome to Fascination Street Podcast, Darren Husted. Am I saying your name correctly?
You are, yes. You got it right on the first try.
Fantastic. This has been a long time coming. I believe you are across the pond in Wolfhamsterdam or something, right? Where are you at?
I'm in Wolverhampton.
Wolverhampton. Man, I don't know why I thought it was called Wolfhamsterdam or something crazy like that.
Yeah, there's a person on the internet who has misnamed it as that many times.
Gotcha. Now, for those of you who don't know, Darren and I first sort of became aware of each other through our mutual, I guess, fanship of a podcast called the Nooner Podcast. It's on Kevin Smith's Smodcast Podcast Network. Anyway, so that's kind of how we are aware of each other. Does that sound about right, Darren?
Yes.
All right, cool. So when did you first get into listening to podcasts? When did you find out podcasts were a thing?
I got an iPod in February 2007, I think, so almost exactly 12 years ago. And at the time, Smodcast had literally just launched like a week after I bought my iPod, or a week before, somewhere around there. So I started downloading, all my music onto my iPod. And then after that, I was like, what else can I fit on here? Because I've got, 30 gig of space and I've barely filled most of it with music. So And then I started listening to Smodcast and the various different shows associated with Smodcast as that network grew.
Right.
And then eventually, the weird thing is when Nuna was actually on Fridays, I think it was on at a weird time, so I couldn't listen to it because I think over here it was like 9 o'clock in the evening or something, and it just didn't work in terms of the time zones, for like a Friday evening.
Gotcha.
And then when they moved to the Tuesday mornings and started doing this morning show, then that's when I was able to kind of like listen live to it. So it was mostly because I bought an iPod, and eventually that led to me listening to Nuna.
Gotcha. Yeah, I started listening back then too. I think Kevin was doing it out of his house, sort of a daily podcast. And then when I guess he had on Dan Etheridge as a guest, I think Kevin was looking for a way to kind of build a network and have a bunch of content available every day, all day or whatever. That's where I first got started with it as well.
Yeah, I mean, when the Smodcast network, as it was, started expanding, I would listen to the various different shows that kind of launched. And truthfully, now these days, I don't listen to most of them. I was a big fan of most of them as they started. And then, eventually it gets a little overwhelming when there's 7 or 8 different podcasts a week to listen to. And I just didn't have the time. And, I started to kind of cut back. You had this morning show started out as 2 different shows, and they were daily. And that was like 10 episodes a week. And at a certain point, there's no way I could listen to like 40 hours of podcasts. And so I kind of fell way behind. And then when Dan Etheridge was on the like one episode where he was talking to Kevin, I was like, oh, this guy's interested. And then obviously, a few months later, they kind of launched Nuna, and I would, download that and listen to that when it came out on like the Fridays or Saturdays. I can't remember exactly when. Usually, I think the downloads were quite good when it was Nuna. It would literally go out and then it would be uploaded a few hours later. So I could generally kind of listen to it within a few hours. It's really weird because, Nuna on Fridays was relatively short-lived. It was only, I think, less than a year. And then, Marty and Dan moved to Tuesdays, and then Dan, became successful again with iZombie and stuff. And so obviously since then it's been Marty for 6 or 7 years at this point. I'm trying to remember when the first episodes went out. I think it was like July 2011, something like that. So once I figured out what the time zones were and how to listen live, then, I was able to kind of listen along live with it, and rather than having to wait for it to kind of turn up as a podcast.
I agree, man. I was right there at the beginning, listening to every show, every episode of every show, and I was all excited. But man, he just kept coming out with new shows and more content and more shows and more content. And, after a while, I couldn't keep up, man. I got a job and a wife and kids, and I couldn't keep up with all that. So I also had to kind of pare down what I'm listening to just for time's sake. And I think that the only one that I listen to on that network with any regularity is the Nooner. I still listen to Hollywood Babylon and Smodcast, but I'm pretty far behind on those. But with the Nooner, I'm never far behind. I pretty much listen as soon as it's released. I'm not able to listen live because I just can't figure that part out. But yeah, I've never missed an episode, and I'm always right there on download day checking it out.
Yeah. I have like other podcasts that I listen to regularly, and maybe it's just me, but like once I had the ability, through like mobile phones to just stream podcasts rather than have to download them, it became easier obviously to listen to them, but it also became easier to just kind of give up listening to them, because at least when you downloaded them, you had to kind of make the effort to be like, I'm definitely going to listen to this because I've gone to the trouble of, using up some data to download it onto my phone, and it's taking up space. And so, you'd kind of make sure you kind of listen to stuff. But when it's just like, oh, the app will stream it for you, it's like, well, I guess, I'll fall behind by a few episodes on some podcasts, and then I'll just kind of unsubscribe just to kind of free up a bit of space or something. But yeah, at the moment, kind of the convenience of Nuna is that it's live on like a Tuesday. So it's normally on like about an hour after I get home. So I can kind of listen, and then once it's done, then it's done, and that's it. And, so whereas a lot of other podcasts, it's like, oh, the podcast has been uploaded or whatever. And so now I've got to kind of put some time aside. And the thing is, as well, is I don't really have like a big commute. Like 10 years ago, I had a commute that was like, 45 minutes each way. So it's about an hour and a half a day. And I could kind of listen to, an episode of some podcasts or a couple of episodes of shorter podcasts. But these days, my commute is like a lot shorter. So, I'll start listening to some podcasts, but I'll be at work before I kind of get halfway through them. So if podcasts are super long, it's very hard for me to kind of subscribe to them and kind of commit to listening to them, where I had to kind of put some time aside and deliberately kind of listen to podcasts. So I kind of prefer to listen to podcasts, I don't know, while I'm doing other stuff, on a journey. Listening to podcasts just seems like a good way to kind of take up time.
Well, I agree. I'm a window washer, like I have a window washing company. And so most of the time that I'm listening to podcasts, either I'm driving or I'm standing on a ladder doing my thing. So it's a really good companion. I love having those available to listen to. But as far as listening live, I just cannot tame that dragon. More than half the time, I can't remember where it's streaming or how to get there. And then I feel like it changed at some point, which made it even more difficult. So it's sort of a combination of me being really stupid, and also I barely have coverage to do anything because, unfortunately I'm with Sprint on my cell phone. So I almost never am able to stream anything just because coverage is so spotty and terrible for me. You must have some really good cell service or coverage, or 3 or 4 or 11 Gs or whatever the hell they're up to now. In your area, you must have a really good coverage.
I think it is. I think my Wi-Fi in my house is probably a lot better than, I don't know what it is. It's like 10 megabits, 100 megabits. I don't know what it is. There's a lot of megabits going on. But yeah, I'm in a city, so we've got fairly good coverage here anyway. So yeah, I don't have problems kind of streaming stuff. So originally it used to be really easy to stream it. And then, they've added a lot of other stuff that makes it a little bit more difficult to stream. But I don't know. I guess you've got to have like a solid internet connection.
I guess you also handle the Nooner's Tumblr account. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I do, yes. There was a thing that was done many, many years ago for the morning show, and I don't even know who ran it, but there was a person who ran this thing that was called the Sin Bin, SIN being Smodcast Internet Network or something. I can't remember like what it was, and obviously Sin Bin being like an allusion to hockey. And that finished, like whoever was listening kind of stopped listening and just gave up on it. And they used to just post links and stuff to what people were saying on the show. So when Nooner kind of took over on the Tuesday morning slot, I actually sent Marty a message in like 2011 now, something like that. Whenever they started on the Tuesdays, I already had a Tumblr anyway, which I'd had since, I don't know, about a year after Tumblr started. And so I said to him, what if I started a Tumblr that took the place of the Simbin? Any articles that you're talking about, I'll just post links there. And then obviously if people are listening along live, they can kind of see the links that you're talking about. And he didn't object to it. So I was like, okay, I'll go ahead. And then another listener, Tyson, he started a Tumblr so he could be named. Because on Tumblr, you can have groups of people editing the Tumblr. And so he also kind of contributes stuff to it when he's listening live. Someone, and again, I don't know who it was, but they bought the domain name Nooner, I think Nooner.com or Tuesday. I can't remember what the kind of link is, but they basically bought a web domain that redirected to the Tumblr so that people could just type that in instead of having to type the whole Tumblr thing, because obviously it's a bit of a long address.
Right.
It used to be Tuesday mornings, but then it changed to Nooner when everything was rebranded as Nooner a few years ago. But yeah, I don't know. It's weird because when I used to listen live, I would kind of tweet stuff at Marty anyway. And then kind of the Tumblr just became a way for me to, any information that I would, needed to be corrected, or any information that was, like particular news stories and stuff like that. It was just like, well, I'll just put them on the Tumblr, and then if anybody else needs to see them, they can kind of see the information. And I've become fairly quick at being able to, as Marty or any of the other people are talking and they're mentioning like a specific story, I've got fairly good at being able to Google different news stories and put links up to them pretty quickly. Or even as someone will start to kind of talk about a subject, I've been fairly good at kind of anticipating, the news story they're going to cover and putting a link to that on the Tumblr. So that, I don't know how many people use Tumblr or whatever, but, it just feels like, it's a nice way to kind of, give something back a little bit. I don't know. It's just a nice distraction when I'm listening to the podcast to be able to just put links there for anyone who needs to find information, or if someone's going back. And the funny thing is, if anyone goes to the Tumblr and just looks at like the archive of it, it just looks really weird because it's like a bunch of really kind of disparate links that kind of don't make any sense unless you've listened to the podcast. So I think it's just kind of fun for that. Not yet, but I stopped using my own Tumblr kind of many years ago. That's the only reason that I really use Tumblr these days, is to just put links for Nooner on there.
I think it's kind of cool that even with all of your busyness and all your other podcasts, you found a way to kind of be a part of it for the rest of us. So thank you for that. And I think it's cool as shit.
Obviously, Marty jokes about how few people listen to the podcast occasionally, but it does get a few thousand downloads at least. And I always think to myself, it's really weird that there's probably a couple of thousand people out there who keep hearing like my name being mentioned on this podcast and have no idea who I am because they never listen live, or they never go to the Tumblr, or they don't go to the Twitter or whatever. They just listen to the podcast and they're probably just like, why does Marty keep mentioning this person's name? Why do they keep saying this person's name? What is he doing that is justified? I don't know. It just kind of amuses me a little bit to think of complete strangers being like, why do people keep saying this person's name? And what exactly is he doing? I don't know. It just amuses me.
And you're definitely not on Sprint, or you wouldn't be able to do anything.
No. I don't know if there's an equivalent provider over here that would be the same punchline, but all the kind of internet service providers and mobile networks over here are very competitive, and they all boast about coverage and speed. So I don't know. I guess the people over here will constantly change different providers all the time. So I guess we've just got a bit more of a competitive market than they have over there.
Well, they all boast about speed and coverage over here too, but they're just a bunch of liars. So it's just a series of one company lying that they're better than the other company, so you switch. It's a pretty big racket over here.
Well, that's one thing that we've definitely got sorted out over here at the moment. I'm not sure how long that will last after Brexit.
Well, let's not talk about Brexit, and let's not talk about the wall. Let's leave those topics for some other folks to talk about. Let's talk about fun, cool shit.
Yes, let's do that.
Are podcasts a pretty big deal over there across the pond like they are over here?
I don't want to boast, but I think we invented the podcast. I mean, if you go all the way back to Shakespeare, I don't know. The first kind of big podcast over here was like the Ricky Gervais podcast. And I think that was done through The Guardian. I have a feeling they did that. I don't know what the download figures on that were, but I'm guessing it was a few million. I want to say it was like about a year before big ones in America came out. Like, I get the feeling that by the time I got an iPod, Ricky Gervais was like kind of known as like a big thing. In fact, double checking, I think it started sometime in like 2001, 2002. So that's before iPods were even around for it to be like a podcast. It was just like a radio show. But like every single show that's on the BBC that doesn't include music, like have podcasts. Like Radio 4 has tons of podcasts and has done for at least a decade. Weirdly enough, even the shows that have like tons of music in, which obviously can't be podcasted, they will do like weird cut down versions where it's like just the bits where they talk in between the songs. And I've never seen the appeal of those podcasts, but like, when Chris Moyles was on The Breakfast Show, I think his podcast was one of the bigger podcasts as well, where it was just the stuff with him kind of talking. And he did a lot of talking between the songs. So it was just everything minus the songs. And I think that's still fairly true today. The weird thing is a lot of the newspapers over here started all doing podcasts, like The Guardian, The Independent, Times. They jumped into doing podcasts quite early on. And then after a couple of years, they all shut down their podcast divisions or whatever. Like the 2 or 3 people who were in charge of podcasts were all kind of let go because they felt there was no way for them to monetize it in any meaningful way. And also it was taking up a lot of time. Like if you've got journalists spending 2 to 3 hours a week just doing podcasts and not actually, writing any stories or stuff, then that starts to eat into a lot of time. And I think, there was a point, I want to say about 6 or 7 years ago, where a lot of places were like, oh, this is the last episode of this podcast. Or, there's a whole bunch of podcasts that just kind of shut down around the same time. I don't know. I don't know that there's a big podcast scene over here. I know that there's some podcasts, obviously, that have been done by like English people or whatever, or British people. But off the top of my head, I can't think of any that are particularly big other than ones that are kind of associated with either radio shows or, newspapers. There's quite a few that are like film podcasts, but again, they're mostly like stuff like the Guardian film podcast or Radio 2 film podcast. Like they're just associated with existing entities already. It's really weird because whenever I talk about any of the podcasts that I do, the first kind of 20 minutes is explaining what a podcast is and then get into the premise of what the podcasts are that I'm doing. So it's still like, even after like 12 years, it's still kind of a bit of a trial to explain what podcasts are. I guess other than saying, they're radio shows, but they never get broadcast on a radio station, which for all the stuff with the BBC isn't actually true. They actually are radio shows that get broadcast and then podcasted later on.
I usually say that it's my very own on-demand internet radio show. That's what I say. So let's talk about your podcast.
Yes, I have one podcast at the moment, but I've had more than one podcast.
Oh, okay. Well, then let's talk about some of your previous podcasts.
The first podcast that I did was called A Talking Cast with an exclamation point and a question mark and an exclamation point. And it was a minute-by-minute podcast about the film A Talking Cat, which was a low-budget film that was done, I think, in 2012 by a director who basically would shoot films over the course of a weekend for like $1 million. And that is apparently what he did with a film called A Talking Cat. I mean, I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Star Wars Minute, which is, you know, a podcast that goes through Star Wars minute by minute. They started with A New Hope, and I think they're currently on Force Awakens. And they've done the trilogy, you know, both trilogies, the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy. And I think sometime next January, they'll be starting on Rogue One, was the film that came out between the two main films. So at this point, there's about 120 of these podcasts in this genre. The premise is you watch a minute of the film and then you talk about that minute. And the amount of time you talk about that minute for is entirely dependent upon whatever happened in that minute of that film. And with The Talking Cat, not very much happens in the film. If you took out establishing shots, which make up roughly 30% of the film, you could probably watch the entire thing in, I don't know, under half an hour, but it just kind of got stretched out to like 87 minutes. And I'm not kidding you, the first 5 minutes of that are credits and the last 9 minutes of that are credits as well. So it's not really a quality film, but I kind of fell backwards into editing that podcast, and I appeared on it like 4 or 5 times, something like that, as a guest. But I was mostly the editor on that one. The weirdest thing being when it started, I hadn't even seen the film, so I edited the first like 15 minutes, I think, before I'd actually bought the film and watched the film for myself. So I was kind of just editing people talking about a film I'd never seen. That was interesting because then when I saw the film, I was like, oh, this all makes sense now, what they were talking about. now I fully get what was going on. But yeah, so that was like my kind of start. And that was like October, November 2014, something like that, where I would edit and upload the episodes after other people had recorded them. And that was my start in podcasting.
That sounds kind of crazy. So then what happened? What was next? And then your current one, or was there another one in between?
Oh, there's been a few. Just as that podcast finished, you know, the people that I'd done that with, which there was about 42, 43, something like that, other people involved in that.
Holy shit. That's a lot of people.
Yeah, there was a lot of guests. I think there was about 30 something guests. And then there was like 4 or 5 people who were the hosts. And so they would kind of rotate. And due to the nature of the film, we didn't have people be guests on consecutive minutes, because generally when nothing happens for 1 minute, the same nothing happened in the next minute, but the minute after that was a different nothing. And so the guests were kind of spaced out across the film, whereas the hosts were kind of there to be the host for 3 or 4 episodes in a row to kind of keep some kind of continuity so they knew what had been discussed. We had like a Facebook group where we would organize who was the guests and the hosts and stuff. And as it finished, one of the, I don't think it was someone who had actually been involved with that, but someone in a different group that I was in on Facebook was like, you know, they'd just seen this film starring Jennifer Lopez called The Boy Next Door, and it's a crazy film. And so I said to the people who, been doing Talking Cast, I was like, should we cover this film? We just spent like 9 months doing Talking Cat. So it's like, should we just keep going and cover another film? And by that point, I kind of had a better idea of how to organize things and, how to kind of divide the film up amongst different groups of people. And we had, I think, roughly half the people who did Talking Cast came back for Cast Next Door. And then other people who'd heard of Talking Cast, but who hadn't kind of signed up, were now willing to be guests. And they were like, can I come on and be a guest? And so I think we finished Talking Cat in June 2015. And then I started Cast Next Door in August 2015. So it was like a 7-week break. But in those 7 weeks, people had already started recording episodes before I started uploading them. So for me, it was basically like there was no break at all. It just literally went from one podcast to another podcast. The organization for Cast Next Door was just a little bit easier because it was easier to break that down into like weekly episodes. Like with Talking Cast, I kind of had people doing different episodes all over the place. But for Cast Next Door, people would just come in and do like 4 episodes for 1 week. And then the next week, a different group of people would do the next 4 episodes and so on all the way through. And then for that, I was a host for 12 episodes myself for like a 3-week period near the middle of the film. And then I came back to do the credits at the end.
That all sounds kind of loco, man.
And interestingly enough, one of the guests on the Cast Next Door was the writer of the film A Talking Cat.
Oh, for real?
Yeah. I was on Twitter and I sent a message to the director and the writer of Talking Cat, and I said, we're kind of covering your film for this podcast. Would you mind coming on and doing like an episode where we like interviewed you about the process? And the director never really got back to us, but the writer was like, yeah, sure, I wouldn't mind. And then he made friends with me on Facebook, and I added him to the group for a Talking Cat. And then when the next project came up, he put his name towards saying I wouldn't mind being a guest on some episodes. And so he was our final episode of a Talking Cat, which was recommended by the AV Club's Podmas. That episode was like featured. And then, he came on and he was a guest for, I think 3 episodes of Cast Next Door, where he, I don't know, he's a really nice guy, and like he was like a really interesting guest, so it was great to kind of have him on.
So was there another one after that?
Yeah, that finished like early January 2016, about 3 years ago now, which to me seems like only yesterday, but yeah, like that's kind of crazy that that was 3 years ago. But yeah, while I was doing that podcast, one of the people who'd been a guest on both of those, she had seen the TV show The Royals, which was on E. It was their first scripted TV show. And she had kind of posted about that, and she was very kind of like enthusiastic. And, she said this show is basically terrible, but it's kind of very watchable. And I suggested to her, would she like to do a podcast covering it like episode by episode? And she said yes. So I was like, okay. So that became my 3rd podcast.
Good Lord.
Which is called Stage of Fools, which is a podcast about this TV show, which is now cancelled. It managed to do 4 series, and we covered every single episode. It's really weird because it's like based on this novel that's meant to be Hamlet told from Ophelia's point of view, but the TV show's absolutely nothing to do with that. And, there's a character in it called Ophelia who after like this, I don't know, the middle of the 2nd season was like written out. So it just kind of ended up betraying the premise of the show. But yeah, so, she found a co-host and they did that. I edited the episodes and stuff, but and I occasionally guested on most of I think all the finales, basically. I just came in and kind of gave my opinion, because I watched the show as well myself. So I came in and kind of gave my opinion on what I thought about, the final episode of each season and also the season overall. We still have one more episode to do with that podcast to kind of wrap it all up now that the show's kind of officially cancelled.
Sure.
That was my 3rd podcast. And then after we finished Cast Next Door, I said to those same people who had so far done 2 podcasts with me, I said to them, how about we cover a film that's good and not a film that's terrible? And I was like, there's a film that I really like. It hadn't been covered so far by any of the kind of minute-by-minute podcast stuff. So I was like, how about we cover Clueless? And a lot of people were very enthusiastic about it. So while I was still editing, because I started Stage of Fools just before Cast Next Door finished, and then I think the 2nd series of Stage of Fools we were covering just as I started doing As If. Basically, there was a period from kind of late 2015 into 2016 where I had 2 podcasts going at the same time.
Wow.
And As If was kind of very successful. It was on the front page of iTunes New and Noteworthy on the podcast. Like it showed up there in the TV and film category for about 5 months. After 5 months, I didn't think we were new anymore, and I didn't think we were that noteworthy, but we were still on the front page for quite a while. That's kind of the podcast where a lot of people, on Twitter and stuff, even now, there's still people who'll be like, they'll just discover the fact that there's a Clueless minute-by-minute podcast, and they'll kind of tweet excitedly that they're going to listen to the whole thing. And I was a host on that for the first like 8 minutes, and then I also came back a few times. I think overall I did like 24 episodes of that, or 25, something like that. There was one of the credits minutes that I did with someone, and it was like almost an hour long, and we're just talking about 1 minute of credits basically. But it kind of turned into more of a discussion about the film kind of in general. So but then once I finished that podcast and Stage of Fools, I think Stage of Fools came back a couple of months for its 3rd season after that. In between, I was like, I really like the show Arrested Development, and obviously I'd already done 2 film podcasts about bad films, and I was still essentially doing a podcast about a bad TV show. So I was like, what if I did a podcast about a good TV show? And so I started a podcast called I Made a Huge Mistake, which was just like an episode by episode recap of Arrested Development. And I started that about 2 weeks before I finished As If, and then that went on into 2017. And then I did the 4th season of that early last year. I still yet to do the 5th season, but I've had a few people who want to be guests for the 5th season. It's just a matter of me organizing it, given that, I started the Prince Track by Track podcast, I don't know, almost 2 years ago now, something like April 2017. So yeah, I don't know. It's really weird because every time I get to the end of a podcast, I'm like, finally, I'll get some time back to myself. And then I think, well, maybe I should talk about this other thing. And so far, people have been willing to kind of sign up and talk to me about, well, I mean, Arrested Development, seasons 1 and 2 were fairly easy to find guests. Season 3 became a little bit harder, and season 4 was quite difficult to kind of find all the guests for the episodes because obviously, you know, it has a kind of reputation at this point. And as I was uploading season 4, I started Prince track by track, so it was just literally there was a few weeks overlap where I had like 2 podcasts going, and then this Christmas just gone, I came up with the idea for a title of a podcast, and I thought to myself, if I could do it like I did the first couple of podcasts, where I wasn't a host, you know, where other people just recorded episodes, then it would be quite easy for me just to edit the episodes because I'd already planned a Christmas break for Prince track by track. And that podcast was called How to Lose a Guy in 10 Episodes. And it is a podcast about how to lose a guy in 10 days. But each group of people that did an episode only covered 1/10 of the film. So it was just 10 episodes. Because I didn't think to myself, I could just, you know, I don't think I could do a minute-by-minute podcast about how to lose a guy in 10 days. But I thought 10 episodes would be fairly easy to do. And most of those episodes had like 3 guests. There was one, I think, that had 4 and a couple that had 2. I think it ended up being 29 people that I kind of contacted, and they kind of just recorded the episodes over a period of months because I came up with the idea like about 6 months ago. And by the time we got to Christmas, like gradually every single person had kind of recorded their episodes. And then so I just edited that up and I put all the episodes up on one day over the Christmas break. So I don't know how many podcasts that makes now. Is that like 7 podcasts? Something like that.
I think it's 1,100.
Yeah. And then as I mean, Prince track by track will finish on the 21st of May. For the final episode, which will be 529 episodes, I think, something like that.
Right.
And then just as I finish that, I'm starting another podcast, which is called The Social Minute.
Good Lord.
Which is a minute-by-minute podcast about the social network. So I'm going to be, coming weekend, I'm going to be recording the first like 25 episodes of that. And I'm hoping to kind of have about 30 or 40 episodes done before I get to the end of Prince track by track, so I can just start uploading those and then give myself a couple of weekends where I don't have to record any podcasts, and then, you know, kind of get back into the swing of recording some more social minute. So, and that should finish sometime around, I think, October this year. At this point, I've been doing this since like 2014, where it's just like one podcast leads into the next. So I'm just kind of used to it. But then I also have to find time to fit in one more episode of Stage of Fools and, I don't know, 8 or 9 episodes of season 5 of Arrested Development. I can't remember how many episodes they actually uploaded in the end. And then 120 episodes of Social Minute. Because fortunately, David Fincher finishes the film exactly at 120 minutes. So I don't have to do like one extra episode that's just talking about 30 seconds of credits or something.
Well, that's a great movie. I'm sure that show's going to be awesome. David Fincher really does put out a quality product. You know, like I said, that's a great movie, and I'm sure it's going to be a cool show. So I'm kind of excited about that. So I think it's really funny that you pick these subjects that sort of are finite, and, you know, you might not know where the end is, but you know that there is one. And so I think it's kind of neat that you chose to do it that way versus, you know, like a show like mine or like The Nooner that doesn't really have an end. You know, it's just forever, I guess. So why did you decide to do it in such a finite way for each one of these podcasts?
Well, the funny thing is you say I don't know where the end is, but I knew when I started Prince track by track that the last episode would go up on the 21st of May 2019 when I started, because I calculated out week by week exactly how many episodes I would need to cover all the albums. And that was the finish date that I put on it when I started it. There's a lot of minute-by-minute podcasts that other people have done, you know, with stuff like Back to the Future or Spider-Man or Lord of the Rings or even Star Wars Minute, where you're having to cover more and more films. And I think it's just chance that, like, it wasn't my idea to do a talking cat. Like, that was suggested by somebody else. And then these other people on Facebook were very enthusiastic about it. And a bunch of people said that they would edit it. None of those people eventually edited it. I ended up doing the whole thing. But it was just this idea that other people had. And back when finished in 2015, there was hardly any minute-by-minute podcasts. So I guess I could have easily picked like a franchise and said, you know, let's cover these 10 films or something. But it's just by chance that I ended up doing 3 films that weren't franchise films. You know, the choice of The Boy Next Door, again, that wasn't really my choice. That was just someone had kind of they were very enthusiastic about the film when they saw it. And so when I saw it at the cinema myself, I was like watching it and I was thinking this film could easily be like every minute something crazy is happening. This would fit the format. And then obviously Clueless was my choice, but it wasn't like I was going to then try and cover every single kind of like teen comedy, like do a minute by minute on all of them. It was just kind of finite. I guess the weird thing is Stage of Fools, we didn't really know if it was going to get renewed for a third. So it was like, we waited for about a month or so. And then after the second season finished, and then they announced the third. And it was the same with the fourth season. Like they announced the fourth season, but then they didn't schedule it for like almost 6 months. And then when the fourth season finished, it took them like another 3 months before they cancelled it. So I guess that was the most open-ended one that I've done. And when I started doing I made a huge mistake. They hadn't announced season 5 of Arrested Development. So I guess I thought that would just be 4 seasons and it would be done.
So now, do you want to talk about Prince track by track?
I had considered covering Prince because the guys who did the Star Wars Minute, they did a podcast called Alphabetical, which is the Beatles' back catalogue, but done alphabetically. Obviously, the Beatles aren't making any new music, so you can arrange it alphabetically and just go through it, and you don't have to worry about like slotting new songs in. And I thought, well, it might be interesting to do that with Prince, like, rearrange his back catalogue alphabetically and then go through it that way, because it's easy enough to rearrange on iTunes or whatever. And this was in 2015 after Prince had released what would turn out to be his final album, Hit and Run Part 2, which came out like 4 months after Hit and Run Part 1. Like the gap was really short. To me, that kind of indicated that Prince was like, if he was going to release another album, he'd release it at the start of 2016 and he'd probably release another one sometime in 2016. Like I thought to myself, there's no point me trying to do this with Prince because all my other previous podcasts have been finite, like you said. And if I started doing Prince's back catalogue, he's going to release another album and another album and another album. And it's going to end up like Star Wars Minute, where I'm just going to have to keep following his career for the rest of my life. And I'm never going to get an end to the podcast. And then unfortunately, he passed away. And it was like, it was devastating for me because, being such a big fan, I was like, for months, I really didn't listen to his music because it was just kind of too traumatic. And I was just like, kind of towards the end of 2016, I was like, well, if I do want to do this Prince podcast, then it feels like, his death, it gives me an end date to it, basically. So it's like, if I start, even though there's going to be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of episodes to do, well, at least I know what the end date on it is. And that will be the final song of Hit and Run Part 2 will be the final episode that I do. But then Warner Brothers released like a compilation thing because they're a record company and that's what they do when artists die. And they added a song on there called Moonbeam Levels, which was a song that Prince had recorded in 1986. And then obviously you have Prince's estate are just going to keep releasing stuff from the vault for, 20 years. There's a point where Alan Leeds, who, was his tour manager, said that Prince had at least 60 albums in the vault. And that was like in the early 90s. I don't know how much of that stuff is out finished albums or if it's just like the amount of tracks he was kind of counting as that, if he was trying to say there's 700 tracks in there or something, and that could make 60 albums. But, for me, when I started the project, I came up with a rule, which is I'm going to cover Moonbeam Levels because that's a song that apparently has been on many bootlegs and a lot of people knew about it. And so kind of the release that Warner Brothers gave it is like the official release of a bootleg track that kind of everyone's already heard anyway. But that's the final track I'm going to cover. I'm not going to cover Piano and a Microphone, which came out a few months ago. If there's any albums released this year, I'm not going to cover those. I'm not going to cover the re-release of Purple Rain, which added 15, 16 songs. I'm just going to cover what Prince released while he was alive. I thought if I did that, then the project becomes very manageable. And it's like covering it at a rate of, an album every other week, effectively. Certainly for the early albums, I was like, well, it will take me roughly 2 years to get through it. And, as long as I had that in mind, then it's like 529 episodes sounds like a lot. Well, I guess it is a lot of episodes to do with a podcast, especially if you're going to be the host for every single one of them. So I was like, but at least I could break it down into like, the first 100 tracks of the 80s, kind of the next 200 tracks of the 90s, and then the final 200 tracks of like the 2000s. And to me, it was just like, well, if I get these done in this certain amount of time, then, I can kind of move on to the next set of tracks. And having an end date in mind made it easier for me to start it because it's like, I know that here I am in 2017. And by the time I get to 2019, 2 years, I think it's like 2 years and 3 weeks after the first episode goes up, the last episode goes up. And, I couldn't have started the project if I didn't know that was good. If I thought to myself, I'm going to have to keep covering more and more albums, I would never have started it in the first place. Obviously, the fact that I'm starting another podcast before I finish this one as well, it's like, it's all well and good having like a finite date, I guess, if that's going to be your last episode. But for me, there's like always just one more podcast. But by the time I get to the end of the social minute, I don't think there's anything else. Like, there's no TV shows that I can think of that I want to cover. There's no other films that haven't, because there's a lot of minute by minute podcasts now, and I don't think there's any other films out there that I would want to cover minute by minute. The ones that I would want to cover, like RoboCop or Starship Troopers or Mean Girls, people have already covered them now. So it's like, there's no point in me doing like a second go round of that. There's no other artist whose music I love as much as I love Prince's music. So as a bonus on Prince Track by Track, I did one album by Beck, which was Midnight Vultures, but that's because it's kind of like a Prince-like album. Like, the stuff that he does in there is kind of his impression of Prince. So I was like, just as a bonus, I'll do that. But like, there's no other artist where I kind of enjoy their entire back catalogue. There's a lot of artists where I could cover like one or two albums, but then by the time I get to the end, I'd be like, I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't know what the last like 30 episodes of this podcast are going to be. It's just going to be me saying, I don't like any of these songs over and over again. And at least with Prince, I know that's not going to happen. Those last kind of 4 albums he put out, a big return to form for him. I mean, there's albums that I haven't enjoyed of Prince's, but as I've gone through the tracks, I find tracks that I really enjoy on those albums. At this point, once I finish the social minute, I can't see there being another podcast that I would want to just do on any other subject. There's nothing that's really kind of out there that I can think about that where it's like, oh, this would be a compelling subject. As the sitcom said, 8 is enough.
Well, I think that it's in your blood. You'll find another one. You'll do another one. I do think it's hilarious that you call looking down the barrel of 529 episodes a manageable amount.
Yeah, well, I mean, if I put it like this, the amount of podcast episodes I'd done before I started Prince Track by Track, episodes that I'd uploaded or edited, was somewhere in the region of 400 anyway. So I'd kind of already done that many episodes. Talking Cast was like 93 episodes, I think. Cast Next Door was like 107, I think, when we finished up. As If was exactly 100 episodes. 52 episodes of I've Made a Huge Mistake. And Stage of Fools, I think, was up to about 33 episodes before I started Prince Track by Track. So I'd already edited and uploaded almost 400 episodes of podcasts anyway. So kind of looking at this podcast, and saying, well, there's going to be 530 something episodes. It's like, well, I've already kind of done that in the last 3-4 years. Doing it again isn't really going to be that much of a problem for me. I recorded a few episodes this weekend, and I think that takes me to, 890 episodes, something like that. The episode I uploaded yesterday, Prince Track by Track, is the 850th that I've edited. And I think at this point I've made about, because I wasn't a guest that much on the first few podcasts I did, before I started Prince Track by Track, I'd only really appeared on 50, 60 episodes of those podcasts. But now I think I'm up to about 600 podcasts or something like that I've done myself personally, where I've been the person yammering on throughout them. So the idea that I get to the end of this year after doing Social Minute, and I think I will have uploaded about 1,100 podcasts in like 5 years. At this point, it just seems like, okay, that seems about right. I did calculate it, and I think it ended up being something like a podcast every day and 21 hours. So about every 45 hours, I was putting up a podcast on average. So
do you have like a wife or a girlfriend or kids or something? Like, how are you fitting all of this time in? This sounds monumentally time consuming.
I don't have a wife or kids, no. So I have free time. Let's put it like that.
Gotcha.
Yeah, but also I've gotten very good at editing while watching TV shows. So I'll have some TV shows on while I'm editing. So it's not like I'm just editing. I'm getting something else done.
Sure.
But with Prince Track by Track, I've got the next, I think, 10 or 11 episodes already recorded. So, I can edit those ahead, spend like a couple of hours editing 3 or 4 of them. And then that means for the next 3 or 4 days, I don't have to edit anything. And so I can kind of make time like that. And that's what I've been doing for the last, 4 years, is editing as far ahead as I can to give myself free time at other times. So it's not like all I do is edit podcasts. But if anyone asks me what I've been doing, then pretty much editing podcasts is the answer.
Right. So since you've been doing this Prince Track by Track, has any of his family or his camp reached out to you, or have they acknowledged what you're doing in any way?
No, not that I've seen, at least. I mean, the thing is as well, I'm not like the first Prince podcast, even though I did get that Twitter handle, which I was very pleased about, because really I didn't want to have like, Prince TBT or Track by something. Like I managed to get the Prince podcast Twitter handle, which I was delighted to do. There's a podcast that's been going for like more than a decade at this point, I think, or almost a decade, which is called Peach and Black, which is like a Prince podcast, but they review album by album. They didn't do them chronologically either. They would jump around, and then whenever he released a new album, they would kind of cover a new album, and then they would kind of jump back and cover the back catalog. And so that's been going on for a while, but that was only like 2 episodes a month or 3 episodes a month, I think, sometimes. And then there is a podcast by a guy called Michael Dean, which is, I think he's got like a network, and he kind of talks to people, like he interviews people who work with Prince and stuff like that. But no, I mean, I don't know that I would really want to kind of have any involvement with them, just because I think the podcast are a fan of Prince talking about his thoughts on those tracks and having guests come on and talk about their thoughts about the tracks. And, you know, some of my guests are, you know, lifelong Prince fans, and others have on occasion never heard the song they're listening to, and so they'll listen to the song that day and then they'll come on the podcast and they'll talk to me about it. And I'm getting very kind of like fresh reactions from people who are listening to songs that, you know, maybe I've listened to for like 20 years or 10 years or, you know, however long. If anyone from like the estate contacted me, other than to probably tell me to stop using Prince's music or stop using the Handle Prince podcast because they want to start one called Prince podcast or something, like, I don't know that I would really want anyone who's associated with Prince to be like a guest, because it's like, I want to try and keep it as a podcast that's just about mostly my thoughts on Prince's songs, but also the guests' thoughts on Prince's song. You know, I wouldn't want it to be corrupted by having to do anything that they said, or, you know, if you understand what I'm saying, like, I just wouldn't want to be compromised. All the podcasts I've done have just been, you know, people talking about their thoughts on certain things. So I think that's the best way to keep it.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, you know, especially if you're this far into it, it would really suck for somebody to come in, you know, kind of this late in the game and throw down some rules, or just like you said, a cease and desist in general. That would really suck. Did you ever have a chance to go see Prince in concert?
I did not know, unfortunately. There were times where Prince was touring over here, particularly like when he did the 21 Nights in 2007, and I just didn't have the money to go and see him because he was in London, and it would have meant me basically staying overnight in London. And I didn't have the money to do that and buy the ticket. And then his final couple of tours, he did like a lot of small venues, and the tickets kind of sold out really quick. And then they were like super expensive. And so between like I think 2007 and 2013, I don't think he even toured over here. So, and then when I was a lot younger, when he was touring quite frequently in Europe, I wasn't a Prince fan as such. There was one tour that he had, which was the Gold Tour, where he was kind of on tour for about 18 months. Went all over Europe, and it was over here for quite a bit. But I just, at the time I was like a teenager, I didn't really have the money to be going to Prince gigs. Tickets were fairly expensive. So I, you know, unfortunately I never got a chance to see him live. The last tour that he was on, one of my friends was like, do you want to get some tickets and go down to London and see him in London? And I was like, sure, you know, like, let's do it. And the tickets had all sold out by the time we finished that conversation. So, you know, I didn't get a chance to see him then. But then in my mind, I was like, well, if I don't see him live this year, it doesn't matter, because he'll be back next year or the year after. And it turned out that no, he wouldn't be back. So it was like I finally got to the point in my life where I probably would have been able to afford to see him live and, you know, go to London and spend like a night in London or whatever, or go to Manchester. And then he passed away. So it's like, well, now I'm not going to get a chance to do that, unfortunately.
All right. Well, you know how they do holograms and shit now of people. Would you go see a Prince concert if he was a hologram? Would you go see that?
No. And I think as well, like, his estate has said that's not possible.
Really?
Yeah. He specifically had it written into his will that his likeness couldn't be used in that way.
I didn't know that. That's crazy.
He gave interviews when they had the whole like 2-pack holograms and stuff where he was like, no one's ever going to be allowed to do that with me.
That's crazy. I had no idea.
So, but even if it happened, it'd be like, well, there's no point. You know, what's the point? I mean, you know, his backing bands like New Power Generation and Revolution, they're both touring, and they have like different people doing the Prince vocals on the songs that they performed with Prince. And if either of those ever kind of like toured over here, then I wouldn't mind seeing them live. But no, I wouldn't go see a hologram.
That was one forward-thinking dude.
Well, I knew that he'd given interviews about not being turned into one. So, no, but like if he didn't want to be a hologram, even if they did find some way to kind of legally get around that and do it, I still wouldn't want to go and see it, because it'd be like, why would I go against Prince's wishes and go and see it? It just wouldn't make any sense.
Right. Back in, it must have been 1996 1997 or 1998 or somewhere around there, I did have the opportunity to go see him in concert, and it was really bizarre because he only played one song all the way through, and it wasn't even his song. The rest of the concert was just like a bunch of different medleys of all of his different songs, and I thought that was really weird. And then, like I said, the only song that he played all the way through from beginning to end, I mean, I guess I didn't even think about that, he probably wrote it, but it was What If God Was One of Us by Joan Osborne. And that was the only song that he played all the way through, and it was just so weird, and it confused me, I guess.
He didn't write that.
Really?
He just covered it on Emancipation.
I had no idea. I thought he wrote it. I couldn't figure out why else he would do that song. That's crazy.
Because he was very religious, and he liked that song.
Ah.
That sounds like it was the New Power Soul tour, where he did lots of medleys. In 98, yeah. He was basically kind of still in dispute with Warner Brothers, so he didn't want to perform stuff from his back catalog.
That makes sense. Guess I didn't think about that. Good job. Thanks, Darren, for clearing that up for me. So did you do an episode of Prince Track by Track with that song?
Yeah, I covered all of Emancipation. That was the first album where he did cover version.
Seriously?
Up until 1996, he'd never recorded a cover version for like a studio album. There's lots of cover versions that he'd done like live. He'd done like little medleys where he'd incorporate other songs, but he'd never actually recorded any kind of cover versions. And then on Emancipation, he did a cover of Bet You By Golly Wow, and he did a cover of I Can't Make You Love Me, and then also La 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 Means I Love You, which I think was the Delphonics, and then One of Us. So he did 4 cover versions on an album that had 36 tracks and was exactly 3 hours long. I don't know why he did that, but he did 3 albums that all had 12 tracks and they were all 1 hour long, so it ended up being exactly 3 hours long. So that was only the 4th cover song that he'd ever recorded. And I don't know why he picked that song, because Joan Osborne like literally had no hits after that.
Yeah, I'm sure she's doing just fine.
I think she made a lot of money off it being the theme tune for Joan of Arcadia.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
So have you had the opportunity to go visit Paisley Park?
Not yet, no.
Now, you did say yet. Does that mean that there's a trip in your future?
Yes, in May I'll be going to Paisley Park. I think that, the last episode goes up on the 21st of May, and then I'll be flying to Minneapolis on the 23rd, and so I'll probably be going to Paisley Park on the Sunday, which is, the 26th or 25th? One of those days. So at some point in the next, 3 months away? Yeah, so in about 3 months' time, I'll be going to Paisley Park.
That's pretty cool. Is this sort of an ending to the Prince Track by Track podcast, like you did 529 episodes and now you're going to celebrate by going to Paisley Park?
No, it's a complete coincidence. It just so happens that weekend, the Monday is like a holiday, both in this country and in America. So it's advantageous for me to go over there. There's some people that I know through the internet who live in Minneapolis that I'm going to go see. So it's just a coincidence that I finished the podcast and then I'm able to go to Paisley Park. It just worked out well.
Are you like super excited and you can't sleep and you're just like a bundle of nerves and energy and just excited like a kid on the day before Christmas?
Not yet, because, I've still got to get like luggage and I've still got to get like dollars. I don't know, there's a lot more kind of preparation. I've still got 65 episodes, I think, actually, of Prince Track by Track to record and edit and upload. So I've still got all that to do before I go. So I think until I get to like the week before, I don't think I'll be that excited.
Are you going to record like your journey of going through Paisley Park?
No, you're not allowed to do that. They're very strict at Paisley Park on what you're allowed to do.
Well, I don't mean like walking through with a video camera and Klieg lights. I'm just talking like, maybe just on your phone, just, hit voice memo record and throw it in your pocket and then sort of mumble to yourself as you're walking through the place.
No, I don't think that would make a good episode. And also, I don't think the people at Paisley Park would be happy with me doing that either. There was a Prince exhibition that was here October 2017. That was at the O2 in London, obviously where Prince had played, for 21 nights in 2007. And so I went to see that. They had like some of Prince's guitars. They had a lot of his outfits. They had some of his like notebooks. They had one of his canes and a couple of his like earrings and various other things. So that was kind of like a mini tour. There was a room that was set up that was kind of about Paisley Park. And they had kind of indications and stuff in there of like the stuff that goes on in Paisley Park now. But for that exhibition, they took your phones away from you and put them in little bags that were sealed that you had to collect when you left. So if they're doing that at just a Prince exhibition at the O2, I feel like Paisley Park is going to be stepping up just a little bit.
Yeah, probably. That makes sense.
Yeah. I don't think you're allowed to take pictures in there, certainly. I think if you want any pictures, you have to buy like a book from the souvenir shop.
Are you going to?
I don't know. I'm not a big gift shop person. Like when I went to see it at the O2, there was like a ton of Prince merchandise and stuff that I could have bought. And I was like, I don't really want to spend like £40 on like a t-shirt, or like £25 on like, a badge or something. Like I might buy something, but I doubt I'm going to be buying anything kind of that expensive. If I can get like a little kind of Prince pin for like a $10 or something, then I might buy something like that. But I know they sell little Paisley Park pins, which is like literally a pin of the building of Paisley Park. And I think they sell them on the shop for like $15 online. So I don't know if they'll be cheaper at Paisley Park, but I might just get one or two of those. But I don't plan on going out there and spending hundreds of pounds on Prince merchandise that you can actually just buy online anyway. But if they're cheaper in the gift shop, I might buy one or two things.
I don't think anything has ever been cheaper at a gift shop.
But if you're buying it online, you've got all the shipping to take into account, haven't you? So
yeah, I guess I didn't really think about that. The shipping to you across the pond is probably pretty significant, I would imagine.
There's also probably going to be some kind of import fee as well, because that's what tends to happen if you order anything from America. Over a certain value, you have to pay some kind of fee once it gets to the border. So for me, things would be cheaper in the gift shop, even if they're the exact same price online.
All right. And how many Prince albums are there?
39.
Okay, so of those 39 albums, do you have a favorite one single album?
Not really, no. I mean, if I had to pick, I guess I would say Sign of the Times, just because I think that's the album where I gave the most amount of 5 out of 5s. Because out of 16 tracks, I think I gave all but 2 5 out of 5s on that. So there's about 14 5 out of 5 tracks for me on that album. But, on Purple Rain, like there's only 9 tracks, but I think 8 of them are 5 out of 5. So that's probably a higher percentage. But I mean, there's only a couple of albums that I don't like. Raven to the Joy Fantastic, which was the album Prince put out in 1999. And there's like 16 tracks on it, and it was a really hard slog for me to get through those tracks. Each episode, I was like, I don't like this album, and I don't like this song. And it was basically a fortnight and a half of me complaining about Prince songs. Pretty much everything else, like there's this thing where in the 90s, there would always be articles about Prince where certain writers would get bored one day, I guess, and would be like, here's a bunch of great songs that Prince has put out in the 90s that you've probably never heard of because he's put so much music out, you can't keep up with it. And, a lot of the times I would kind of agree with their choices. I think Gold's a really good album, and Chaos and Disorder was like a contractual obligation thing, but there's only 10 tracks on it, and I think about 6 of them, I think I gave 4 or 5 out of 5 to. So I particularly like the last 4 albums that he put out. 2 of them are kind of only really compilations of songs, because for Hit and Run 1 and 2, he'd started doing like random songs on, he'd put them on SoundCloud and all kinds of stuff like that. So he then kind of collated them on these 2 albums. And I enjoy those albums, but I don't think they're really albums. They're just random collections of songs. Whereas I think Artificial Age and Plectrum Electrum, those 2 albums are probably as strong as anything that he did kind of in the early 90s or in the mid 80s. So if I was going to pick albums from different decades, I would probably say Sign of the Times for the 80s and Diamonds and Pearls for the 90s, and then maybe Plectrum Electrum for the 2000s. Well, Plectrum Electrum is the 2010s. So I don't know, I'd probably say Musicology for the 2000s. But, when you've got 500 something songs, it's very hard to kind of narrow it down to just a collection of 10 or 11 of them out of those 500.
So let's make this extremely difficult then. You're on a desert island. You've got one song you're allowed to take with you, one Prince song. What song is that?
Starfish and Coffee.
Good Lord, you answered fast. You didn't even pretend to think about it.
I mean, I could pretend to think about it and then come back to Starfish and Coffee, but I mean, Starfish and Coffee or Forever in My Life are probably the 2 favorite tracks that I've got off Sign of the Times. And if that's my favorite album, then it's, it's just going to be a choice between one of those. But I would say probably actually Forever in My Life, because the production on Starfish and Coffee is a little thinner than Forever in My Life, whereas Forever in My Life, the song kind of fades out and you can kind of loop it back on itself. So it wouldn't be a problem listening to it, but, if you're stuck on a desert island forever, because it just kind of would work as a loop. Whereas Starfish and Coffee starts with the sound of like a school bell, and it's a bit harsh as a start. So hearing that looping over and over would maybe get a bit tiring. Whereas I think Forever in My Life, you could just kind of listen to that on the loop and it'd be fine.
Gotcha. That's a pretty well thought out answer. It's almost like you have considered this question before.
Well, I've been podcasting about this for 2 years. It's not going to be hard for me to kind of answer any Prince questions at this point.
You're not messing around, man. A true fan. I like it. All right, Darren. Well, as we're heading out, can you tell everybody where they can find you on social media and where they can find all of your previous million podcasts so that maybe they can check those out?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you search for any of the previous podcasts that I mentioned, which is A Talking Cast, Cast Next Door, Stage of Fools, as if I've made a huge mistake, or How to Lose a Guy in 10 Episodes. If you search for those on iTunes or Facebook or Twitter, I'm sure you can find me through that. Prince Track by Track is on Facebook at Prince Track by Track. It's on Twitter at Prince Podcast. Me personally, I'm at my own name on Twitter, which is Darren Husted.
And lastly, Darren, is there anything that we didn't talk about or that I didn't ask you about that you wanted to talk about on the show?
No, I feel like we've covered like 850 episodes of podcasts that I've done, so that's pretty much covered everything for the last 4 years of my life.
Well, Darren, thank you so much for taking the time out of your obviously busy day and schedule to hang out with me and let us get to know you a little bit more on Fascination Street. I look forward to, hearing Marty talk about you some more, and I look forward to you finishing up Prince Track by Track, and I'm very excited to check out the Social Minute when that comes out. And then whatever million podcasts you decide to do after the Social Minute.
My plan is after Social Minute to retire from podcasting.
You'll never stop, dude. It's in your blood, man. You've been doing this for 1,000 episodes now. You can't quit.
Well, yeah. So also, if you want to follow Social Minute on Twitter, that's at social_minute.
And when do you think the Social Minute will start dropping episodes?
Probably going to be the last week of April, if I'm honest, before those episodes start coming out.
Maybe after the Social Minute, maybe you could do a minute-by-minute type of podcast about, the movies that Prince was in or something like that.
Funnily enough, one of the other podcasters I mentioned who has like a Prince podcast, he started doing Purple Rain minute by minute, but he gave up at about minute 25. Talking about each of the songs on those different films, I've kind of covered the kind of plot of the film, so I don't think there's anything else for me to discuss. If I was talking about Purple Rain, I'd just be talking about the performances, basically. So, and I've already talked about those songs, so I don't think there's any fresh insight that I could give. But I've got no problem with somebody else trying to do Under the Cherry Moon minute by minute, because I feel like that would be torture.
Well, again, Darren, I really appreciate your time, and thanks again for being willing to do this from all the way across the pond in Wolfhamsterdam, or wherever the hell you are. How do you say it again? Wolverhampton. Man, I messed it all up again. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Sorry, everybody who lives in Wolverhampton. Anyway, Darren, it was amazing to talk to you. This has been a long time coming. I've been really looking forward to it for quite some time.
That's no problem.
And I want you to have a great rest of your day, all right? Thanks a lot, man. I appreciate it.
No problem. It's great speaking to you.
You have a great day.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Opening music is the song Magnolia from the 2014 album Intransigence, used with permission from Douglas Miles Clark. Closing music is Apollo from the 2001 album Into the Known by the band Sapphire. Thanks for hanging out with us and getting to know a little bit about our guest. We'll see you next time on Fascination Street.